Okay, so I think we've got it perfect now. So today we're going to have a webinar with Quinton Jones of the West Virginia Department of Agriculture. Quinton first presented this material for us at the producer meetup that we held at the Robert C. Byrd Institute in Huntington this past July. So here's just another way for him to share this resource. Quinton, welcome to the webinar and thanks for joining us.
Thank you. I'm sorry about the technical problem on my end.
That's okay. There's always something.
Yeah.
So does anything else you'd like to say before we get started this morning?
No, I just appreciate whoever may be listening, joining us, and hope that this is informative. And of course, if there are questions, we want to make sure that we can get all those answered. And I'll allow you to lay the groundwork for how we're going to do the questions if you haven't already. And we'll just make sure that at the very end, if you haven't got your question answered, that there'll be contact information there, and you can always follow up by contacting me directly. But hopefully we'll try to answer most of these questions as we go through.
Okay, I think that sounds great. So I think the best way to kind of moderate questions is there's a chat box. So if any of the participants feel that they have a question that can be asked through the chat feature, you can feel free to go ahead and type them there. But if you feel like you need to talk, I can give you control or the ability to talk for anyone who may be in attendance. So if you want to raise your hand or just type into the question box that you would like to verbally ask your question, that's fine too. So just let me know.
Okay.
All right, Quinton, ready for the next slide?
Yes, ma'am. Okay, so again, just going to be talking about some of the requirements that we look at here in West Virginia from a regulatory standpoint when it comes to selling meat or poultry here within the state of West Virginia. And one of the things I want to point out right off the reel is that there are two options for selling meat in terms of who does the inspection. One is the federal agency that's under U.S. Department of Agriculture, and it's specifically called the Food Safety Inspection Service. And those are the federally inspected meat plants. And then there's also our state program here in West Virginia, and that's under the West Virginia Department of Ag and us here in the Meat and Poultry Inspection Division. And not all states have that opportunity or that option. 27 of the states have their own state meat inspection program, and so West Virginia, I think, is fortunate to have both options. There are some limitations when it comes to the state inspection, only from the perspective that the Federal Meat Inspection Act and the Poultry Products Inspection Act require that if products are going to go across state lines, you must use federal inspection. And so that's really only the biggest difference and the main difference. Otherwise, we adopt and use the federal regulations and follow the same policies and procedures. And so very much similar in the way that we go about doing our inspection and the standards that we follow, but there is still a limitation if you're trying to send stuff across state lines. Let's go on to the next slide. Okay, and so on this kind of colorful sort of flow diagram, I want to kind of lay this out as to some possible options for how you might be able to sell the animals that you raise. And it's a little bit busy here on this slide with some different stuff going on, but I'm going to try to explain this in a little bit simpler terms so that you walk away from this slide having a better understanding of it. As I just said, in West Virginia, there's both federal inspection and state inspection. In other words, two different plants have the option of applying for either federal or state inspection. And on this slide, for the most part, we're talking about those interchangeably, and they're going to be in green. So let's start up in the left-hand corner at commercial slaughter. For a product to be sold as a meat product or poultry in the state of West Virginia and everywhere else in the country as well, it must have been inspected. And it could have been under federal license or under state license, i.e. it could have been a federally inspected plant or a state inspected plant. but it could not have been just sold to the public without inspection. The only way for that to happen, if you sell your animal live on the hoof to somebody who comes and says, I want to buy your animal, then absolutely no problem, because we're not talking about a slaughtered and processed animal. We're talking about live on the hoof. But if we're talking about a slaughtered and processed animal and the resulting products, it must have gone through commercial slaughter to sell the pieces, the products, directly to the public. Let's jump down to the bottom left corner, and for just a moment, you can see there in orange, it says custom slaughter and processing. And what that means is that there are plants out there that do not have animal by animal inspection, neither by the federal government nor by us here in the West Virginia Department of Ag. But we do license those facilities, and we make sure that they are sanitary and that they have all the required features. They follow all the record-keeping rules. But we don't do the inspection, and therefore, if you take an animal to one of those facilities, they will provide the service, slaughter and processing, and then you'll have products that are resulting from that, but they're not eligible for sale to the public. So this I throw on the slide only because it's not necessarily what a lot of people or producers are looking for, but it is an option for some. And the way this would work is that you must sell your live animal to a customer, and then they become the owner of that animal before it actually goes to this custom slaughter and processing plant. You are allowed to carry that animal there to the plant for them. They, though, should be the owner by that time, meaning they should have paid you for it. Then the new owner becomes the one that's responsible for the slaughter and processing fee. When they pick up the products, it's only for their use, for their family's use, the owner in their household, the non-paying guests, and the employees of that owner. They cannot sell the product to the public. So that is an option, but it's limited. A lot of people are looking to be able to sell directly to the public, and the custom slaughter and processing route will not allow you to do that. But for some people, this is a perfectly acceptable way of marketing their animals. But jumping back up to the top, into the top left-hand corner, the commercial slaughter being required for any sales to the public. So once the slaughter has taken place under either federal or state inspection, now we have a few options. It could continue on down to the next green box. It says commercial processing. And again, that could either be under a federal or state license. And if it's processed commercially, then the package will receive labels that will show that it's been inspected and passed, and then it will be eligible for sale and distribution throughout the state, and if it's under federal inspection, throughout the country. And if you go to the right there and it says unlimited sales to the public, it really doesn't matter, with the exception of going across state lines, where that product is sold or perhaps even how many times it's sold. So it could go to a distributor or through a wholesale warehouse and then be resold once or twice before it actually makes it to either a restaurant or the end consumer in a store. If let's imagine in terms of the local farmer, if I want to take my steer or hog or whatever it is, and I want to sell my product in my community, then that's probably the route I'm going to need to take. I'm going to need to take it to a commercial slaughterhouse, either federal or state, and then they need to do the processing there as well. And then once that's the case, I can take those products back to my home, my facility, and then I can sell those piecemeal to the public. To do that, you do need to get a distributor's license from us here in the West Virginia Department of Ag Meat Inspection Office. And we will do an occasional check of the facility, which could very well be a chest freezer or an upright freezer. We'll do a check occasionally to make sure that it's sanitary, that the product is held at the right temperature, that the labeling has not been changed, that you're keeping all of your personal products separated from those products that are sold for the public. But the bottom line is that is one growing route that I see small producers using is just taking it through a commercial slaughter plant and through commercial processing, and then taking the products home and selling either out of their freezer on their farm, or perhaps even taking it to a farmer's market, or perhaps selling it directly to a restaurant or a grocery store. And that would be the route that you would need to take. It would need to go through commercial slaughter, commercial processing, and then it's eligible for sale either within the state, if it's state inspection, or throughout the country if it's federal. Let's start back up in the left-hand corner again. Now, if you go directly to the right, you see a red box, which, again, we're talking about custom, which means it's not for sale to the public. The reason that's on there is that, let's say I'm interested in buying a beef or a hog, or half a beef or half a hog, and I haven't raised the animal myself, but I know this farmer down the road, and I go and I say, well, I'm interested in buying your animal, and I kind of trust the guy, but I just want that extra layer of security. So I asked them to take it to a commercial slaughter plant where the slaughter will be done under inspection, meaning there will be an inspector checking every animal for its health and for its eligibility to be used in the public food supply. And so that gives me an added level of comfortability, if you will, because now I know that at a neutral party, if somebody has actually checked that animal just to make sure that it is safe to eat. But I don't necessarily need it labeled to sell to the public, so I'm just going to use it for myself, and perhaps the plant will give you a price discount perhaps if they do it as custom. And so even though it started out as an inspected animal, a carcass, the plant can then process it as a custom carcass. But once they do that, then the packages will receive the not for sale stamp, and it will no longer be eligible for sale to the public. But it is an option. And then the third option that results from, or third possibility that could result from commercial slaughter, is that the product goes to a retail exempt facility. And typically these are the ones you would think of a local meat market, or perhaps a grocery store meat market. That's just kind of the thinking when we think about a retail exempt facility. But this also includes restaurants, commercial kitchens. It must start, obviously, with commercially inspected carcasses or meat products from those carcasses. Typically, these retail exempt facilities are under the county health department's permit. They can be sold. The products can be sold, can be processed there, or further processed and then sold to the public. But the limitation on this is that they must sell those right there on site. Or if they sell them in a different venue, it has to be the people from that retail exempt business doing the selling. They cannot distribute, they can't pass it on to somebody else to sell. They can't sell it wholesale. It has to be that business selling that product there on site, typically on site. But we've always kind of looked at that as an extension. Let's say they were selling it at a farmer's market, as long as it was those employees selling the product, we kind of look at that as an extension of their business. So to kind of summarize that again, starting up in commercial slaughter, upper left-hand corner, from there you have three options. It can either be processed as custom, which means it's no longer for sale to the public, but that might be okay. It could be processed at a retail exempt facility, which means it can be sold to the public, but only from that business, only at that location or by somebody from that business. And then the third option is it could be processed commercially, and then it's unlimited sales, except if it's under state inspection, it must be sold within the state. And then at the bottom is just a slightly different route where it's not inspected and therefore not eligible for sale to the public. So that took a lot more time than maybe you were expecting, but that's a very important part of understanding what you can do with the meat. And this would apply to poultry as well. But for the red meat species, beef, pork, sheep, and goats, this is pretty much your options if you're not selling the live animal to somebody. So let's go on to the next slide. And so to figure out then where you might be able to take your animal, depending upon which of those routes you might want to follow, I can give you some information here on this slide that might direct you to the right plant. There are a few commercial federal plants in West Virginia. They are on the FSIS, that's Food Safety Inspection Service website. It's not separated out just by West Virginia, but you can go to their directory and you can do a filter search by changing the state to just West Virginia, and it will list all of the USDA, FSIS facilities here in West Virginia. Some of those will not be slaughter facilities, so you have to you may have to give them a call and find out what services they're offering. For the state-inspected slaughter and processing plants, they would be on our website, the WVDA website, and I think that is wvagriculture.org. And if you go there, on the very first page, you will see at the top a bar that has the word divisions. And if you click on divisions, you'll see on the left column meat and poultry inspection. If you click on that, then you will have a list on the left-hand side of the commercial plants and the custom plants. And so both are available there on our website. And if you have problems getting to that, of course, you can just give us a call here at the office. One thing I do want to point out, because sometimes this is confusing, and I certainly can understand why, but just because a plant has as its name or uses in its name the words commercial or custom, it does not necessarily mean that they may have that they would have that particular license. And so if we had a plant that was called Quinton's Commercial Meat Shop, it does not necessarily mean that I have commercial inspection on every animal. I might very well be a custom shop, but I just wanted to call my meat shop a commercial shop. So vice versa, if it's Quinton's Custom Meat Cutting or Meat Shop, that does not necessarily mean that I'm not providing inspection or the meat inspector. It's not that I don't offer that service. The inspectors could very well be there and do inspection on each animal. So the best thing I can advise you to do would be, if there's any question or if you're not sure, is to give the plant a call and actually talk with them about the services that they offer, and be specific in asking, does the inspection service provide inspection every animal? And explain to them what you want to do, that perhaps if you're wanting to sell at a farmer's market or to restaurants, if you make that clear to them, they'll know exactly what you need. But don't just assume because the name includes the words commercial or custom that it has that particular license. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. I want to jump back for just a second and talk a little more about that distributor's license that I mentioned in that flow chart. And let's say this is going to be somebody who wants to take their animal that they've raised on their farm and have it slaughtered and processed under inspection, and then sell either at a farmer's market or to sell off of their farm, or they want to sell directly to a restaurant or a grocery store. If they're going to be holding, if you're going to hold that product, meat or poultry products, here in the state of West Virginia at your location, at your facility, whether it be a home or a different building on your property, if you're going to hold that product overnight, then we expect that you would have a distributor's license from our office. And what will happen is a compliance officer will come out occasionally and will check on some of those things that are listed there, and as I mentioned earlier, and provided everything's all right, you'll just continue to renew your distributor's license for as long as you need it. It's at the moment a $5 charge. It's very little, and it gets renewed at the end of every June. So just pointing that out, if you're going to be selling meat here in West Virginia, then you do need to get the distributor's license. The only time that you would not need it is if you took all of that product directly from the commercial plant and to the final customer. So let's, and this does happen occasionally. Let's say that I've sold an entire beef, we'll say, to a person, and they want me to deliver it to them. Well, I take it to a commercial slaughter plant where they do the slaughter and the processing under inspection, and I then take those products to them because they've been inspected. I don't have to have the money beforehand. I can take the products to them directly from the slaughter plant, receive payment for the products, deliver 100% of those products to them, and I don't need a distributor's license. The only thing I've done is transported the product from the slaughterhouse to the customer, but I've not held the product overnight at my property or my business or my facility. So a scenario like that, you would not need a distributor's license. Okay, let's go on to the next slide, please. So all of what I've said so far is kind of under this idea that if you're going to sell meat to the public here in West Virginia, that it must be under inspection, and that corresponds to the green boxes in that flow chart. However, as usual, there are some exceptions, or in this case, we call them exemptions to that rule. And these are 4 that I want to just kind of talk about. The first 2 especially, the poultry and rabbit exemptions, I think have become a lot more popular here in West Virginia as some things have changed from a regulatory standpoint in the last couple, 3 years. And then a couple other scenarios. Let's move on to the next slide. And so thinking of the poultry exemptions here in West Virginia, we now recognize 2 of them, the 1,000-bird exemption and the 20,000-bird exemption. Both allow for uninspected, at least not by us, on-farm slaughter of poultry by the producer and then the sale of those products within West Virginia. What that means, and I'll come back to the last sentence in a second, but essentially what that means is I can raise my own birds on my farm and then slaughter and process those birds on my farm for then to be able to sell those products to the public. And that is totally legal under these exemptions. Now, there are some requirements which we're going to get to in a second, but this, sometimes surprises people. Of course, there's a 1,000-bird exemption that most people would probably enter and under, and maybe would grow to the point that they might want to explore the 20,000-bird exemption. And they are very similar, and we'll go over the differences in just a second. But bottom line is, I have to raise my birds. I can't take somebody else's adult birds onto my farm and slaughter them for them. That's not what this exemption is about. It's for me as a small producer to raise my birds on my farm, slaughter my birds, and sell to the public. So it really doesn't involve providing the service to anybody else. And then the last sentence there, voluntary registration is an option, and this is something that's a little bit newer for us. We are offering this voluntary registration, and it is exactly what it says, voluntary. But if you register with us here in the Department of Agriculture, Meat and Poultry Inspection, we will send you a certificate to show that you have been registered with us. And that can be useful, especially if you are selling, at a farmer's market, or perhaps would like to sell to a restaurant or a grocery store, or even just to your neighbor. If they know, or you tell them or communicate to them somehow that you are registered with the Department of Ag, I think it does probably give them a little more, they're more comfortable in buying the product sometimes, because they feel like it's not, there is some oversight. Now, granted, it doesn't mean that we're going to come out and start running around your farm looking at the birds. It just simply means that you have registered with us. We will not be doing bird-by-bird inspection, but some people are a little hesitant to buy if they know that this is done just on the farm and nobody's really taking a look at every bird. And this kind of offers maybe a little bit of just a little more comfortability for that customer to buy it, knowing that it is registered with the state of West Virginia. Again, it is voluntary. The registration form is available from our office. If you fill it out and send it in, we will return you a certificate. There was no charge to it whatsoever, and we will not be renewing those on a yearly basis. We would ask that if you change and you're no longer employing or working under the poultry exemptions, then we would ask that you let us know, or if your address was to change, we would rely upon you to let us know. So pretty simple and straightforward there on the voluntary registration. Move on to the next slide. So let's talk a little bit about 1,000-bird exemption. Obviously, it's a maximum of 1,000 birds within a year's time. And I don't know if it's on a later slide, but I'll just go ahead and tell you that does include chickens, turkeys, and ducks. So it's the combination of all of those that you might be raising and slaughtering. So you could do, let's say, 500 chickens and 500 turkeys, and then you would meet your maximum for that year. Even though meaning WVDA, is not doing the inspection on every bird, that doesn't change the fact that those birds need to be healthy whenever they're slaughtered. And that's going to rely upon you, the small producer, or if you're using this exemption, you need to make those evaluations. You need to look at the birds and decide, are they healthy enough to be slaughtered? You don't want to use this exemption to get rid of the cull birds that, I can't stand, I couldn't eat that myself, therefore I'm going to slaughter it and sell it to the public. I think that's going to be a bad plan. I think that's going to come back and bite you. But hopefully that the idea that you're taking pride in your birds would come through here, and that you would evaluate the birds for their healthiness, because it is required. And should we find out that sick birds are being sold to the public, we will be following up on that. Of course, they have to be slaughtered and processed on the farm where they were raised. And to answer a question that I sometimes have been asked is, can I buy chicks from a mail order or from the southern states or whatever? Yes. We're not talking about chicks. You can buy chicks. You don't have to hatch your own chicks. But once they've started, once you've started growing them, that's pretty much what we're talking about when we talk about raising the birds on your own farm. And again, not only should the birds be healthy, but they need to be slaughtered in a sanitary manner. And even though we're not going to be there watching over your shoulder, you would want to take as much pride and as much effort in the process, and to keep that as sanitary as possible. There are obviously some different ideas of what sanitation is. The way this typically works out is until there's a complaint, there probably won't be any issues. Our compliance officer does spot checks at farmers markets and elsewhere. If they happen to see the birds and they don't it looks like they have not been processed in a sanitary manner, there would be some follow-up. If a customer would complain about the bird, the product that they have bought, then there would be some follow-up. So it does need to be done in a sanitary manner. Must be labeled, and these are the things that are required on the label. Product name, your processor's name, that's the farm name or business name and address, the net weight, safe handling instructions, and the pack date. And I'm going to say that on the, check to make sure, on the safe handling instructions, I don't know that I have a slide later, but if you just think about the safe handling instructions that goes with raw products, typically at the top of that, it starts out with a statement that says, this product was prepared and passed from inspected meat and or poultry. The safe handling instructions that you put on these packages of exempt poultry products must not have that statement. If you download a JPEG file off of the internet, or if you buy rolls of these safe handling instructions or make them up, from a sketch or whatever, it's got to exclude that one statement about it having come from inspected poultry, because it has not. So just point that out to you. Next slide, please. Of course, it cannot include the inspection legend, and then under this poultry exemption and the other one, it cannot cross the state line. Distributor's license is not required, just simply because let's say you're holding exempted poultry products at your farm or your house. You do not need a distributor's license for that. However, if you are holding other meat or poultry that is inspected, then that does require the distributor's license. And while our compliance officer may be by checking up on that, they'll probably take a look at the exempted products as well. And then you need to keep records as to the number of birds slaughtered and to whom they were sold. I don't think we've gotten too nitpicky about that. We don't ask to see, well, this bird was sold to Sally and this bird was sold to Jane, but we do like to have some idea about how many you've sold and where they were sold. So if you make a sizable sale to one person, let's say you sold 50 birds to Greg's meat market, that would be the record that I would enter and the date that I sold it to them. If I sold 20 birds at the farmer's market, a local farmer's market, then I'd probably put that down. I wouldn't necessarily try to find each individual's name and write it down. Okay, next slide. And we're going on to the 20,000 bird exemption, which is very similar. So I'm going to skim through this a little faster. Obviously, the maximum is 20,000 per year. You must operate under one or the other exemption. during a calendar year, not both. So if you foresee exceeding 1,000 birds, then you probably want to start out the year under the 20,000 bird exemption. And the difference in terms of sanitation is that we expect anybody who's going to be doing more than 1,000 birds in a year probably going to need a little more of a enclosed facility, one that's more designed to handle the waste, the water, the blood. The equipment should be readily cleanable. When you start thinking about thousands of birds, even if we're only talking about 3,000 or 4,000, that becomes time consuming just to clean up the equipment. And we're looking for something a little more substantial in terms of facility if you're going to employ the 20,000 bird exemption. Next slide. Of course, they cannot okay, so they can't bear that inspection legend. And I think I've already talked to you about what's got to be on the label, and I just mentioned that you can only use the one exemption per year. Next slide, please. Okay, that's where I was talking. So again, records for 2 years, no distributor's license is required. One little caveat added here is that you cannot have more than 3,000 birds on your farm at any given time if you're operating under the 20,000 bird exemption. Usually that's not a problem. If there are specific questions on that, you can give me a call and we can talk about it. Next slide. And this is an example from earlier when I was talking about the safe handling instructions. The one on the left is what you would typically see on inspected commercial meat or poultry. And you can see the bottom, the top sentence there under that on the left. This product was prepared from inspected and passed meat and or poultry. On the right, doesn't contain that, and it should not. And so you just want to be careful if you're buying rolls from a butcher supply. A lot of times they'll have that first statement on there. So you'd either need, at the very least, blacken it out, or if possible, and you're downloading a JPEG file off, you can sometimes use some sort of program to kind of get rid of some of that wording, and then everything else should be fine. Next slide. Okay, so that was the poultry exemption. Now let's think for a little bit about the rabbit exemption. There are 2 parts to the rabbit exemption, meaning that you can have your rabbits that you've grown on your farm slaughtered at a licensed establishment under this exemption, and that would mean that we would not do animal by animal inspection, but the facility, the licensed establishment, is just providing this service for you. The other option, which has become very popular, is the slaughter on farm. And that was only added within the last 2 or 3 years. And it makes it a little bit easier, especially because there aren't a lot of licensed establishments offering this service. Next slide. And to compare the two, you can see that 20,000 rabbits are allowed up to 20,000 healthy rabbits per year. Whether we're talking about the facility or we're talking about the farm, either one. They do need to be healthy. The same idea applies here as with the poultry. You need to evaluate the rabbits and make sure that they look healthy, healthy enough for slaughter. On the left side, obviously it needs to be a facility that is licensed with us, with the Department of Agriculture. And then, of course, the labeling is going to apply, and no distributor's license is required. Going to the right side, same pretty much so as if you were taking them to a licensed establishment, except you're doing them on your farm where you raise them. And it's just like the poultry exemption. You cannot bring in other rabbits and slaughter them for somebody else. You have to do your own rabbits. Okay, so the labeling is pretty much the same. And again, no distributor's license is required. Next slide. Okay, so in both cases, whether we're talking about a licensed establishment or if you're doing it on your farm, there's going to have to be some procedures that you have to show exactly what you're going to do. And if this is at one of our licensed establishments, they would have to submit procedures to us for approval. If you were doing this on your farm, you would want to submit those, and they're going to be on the registration form, and I'll get to that in a second. But you do need to describe to us exactly how you're going to go about doing the slaughtering and processing. from the point of stunning all the way through labeling. There is no fee. If we slip down, let's just kind of focus on the right side, because I don't want to confuse you, and most of the stuff is the same. So let's just focus on the on-farm slaughter, because the licensed establishments know if they're participating, they know what they're required to do. So let's focus on the right side. You do need to register, and this is not a voluntary registration. You must register with us in the West Virginia Department of Ag annually. There is no fee for that, but the registration form does get renewed every year, and we will send out a license renewal, or registration renewal, usually around May, so that it's finished and taken care of before the end of June. And then records, again, must be kept. Now, at the bottom, something that just passed in the last year, those rabbit products now can be sold anywhere within the state of West Virginia, both wholesale, retail, to the end consumer. It doesn't matter. You can sell it to whomever you would like to, but it does have to be within the state of West Virginia. Next slide. And that was effective on April 22nd, so that's really rather new to us, and there are some people taking advantage of that already, and so we hope to see that grow. But once again, total of 20,000 healthy rabbits per year from the farm, and they can now sell those to anybody in the state of West Virginia. It's no longer restricted to just the end consumer. Okay, next slide. So that kind of summarizes the rabbit and the poultry exemption. And then there's a couple other things I'd like to just point out in terms of products that have a little quirkiness to them when it comes to the inspection. Buffalo, bison, and some other things like that, elk, reindeer, probably need to be inspected, but it's a little different for them because the federal government does not recognize them as traditional livestock species. And so if one of those federally licensed plants was to offer slaughter and processing services, there will be what we call voluntary inspection charge. And I forget now what the rate is for the federal government. I want to say it's somewhere between $70 and $80 per hour for that slaughter and processing to take place at one of the federally licensed slaughter and processing plants. We also have, but I think it's a lesser amount that we charge or can charge for that. So I'm just pointing that out. I don't think it affects a lot of people, but there is a little difference to these species because they're not considered to be traditional or non-amenable to the Federal Meat Inspection Act. Also non-amenable to the Federal Meat Inspection Act are deer. And in West Virginia, we now have the West Virginia Captive Cervid Farming Act, and it specifically does require that any cervids like deer, elk, moose, caribou, reindeer has inspection if it's going to be sold in the state of West Virginia in terms of deer products, venison products. Game deer is not a part of this, and so game deer is still under the West Virginia Department of Natural Resources jurisdiction and control, and as I understand it, game deer, any game, no game is allowed to be sold to the public in terms of harvesting and selling the meat products. The only time that there's some overlap here is whenever we talk about the Hunters Helping the Hungry program, which is a DNR program that allows for hunters to drop off game deer that they'd like to donate to this program. They must be dropped off at a registered facility, one that's registered with the DNR and that has a license from us. And then the product is processed, and the resulting products go to one of two food banks here in West Virginia. But when we're talking about farm-raised deer, then that must be slaughtered and processed under our inspection here in the state of West Virginia. That may be different when you go to other states. And so when we're talking about non-amenable species, there's a lot more flexibility and variation from one state to the next, whether we're talking about buffalo, bison, or in the case of deer or other cervids. Okay, next slide. And if you were talking about buffalo, bison, or deer or other non-amenable species, and this would also apply to poultry, like quail, It's not a traditional poultry species. Certainly here in the state of West Virginia, and I think that's the case also in most other states, they have a triangle stamp that will be on the label to show that it has been inspected, but it's not a traditional species. Nevertheless, it shows that there was inspection and that it did pass in that inspection. Okay, next slide. And then there are a few products out there that just because of tradition and history and a number of other things don't necessarily fall under meat inspection, at least completely. I would like to say that there's a hard and fast rule as to determine which goes where, but not so much. There are some pretty good rules of thumb, but everything has an exemption or exception. The one that we probably go by the most is if there's less than 3% raw or less than 2% cooked meat, then it is probably not under the meat inspectors, but more under the Food and Drug Administration. And then there are also those little quirky things like pepperoni rolls and closed-face sandwiches, and that's just an example. Those biscuits that are there on that box are considered to be closed-faced, meaning the bun is closed, and for that reason, it's an FDA product. But if they had those open and the sausage patty was completely excuse me, if the sausage patty was completely exposed, then it would be a meat inspection, Food Safety Inspection Service product. It would fall under meat inspection. So little quirks like that, but probably not going to affect most of you all. Next slide. Pepperoni rolls maybe, but if you get into pepperoni rolls, give me a call and we'll talk about it. Let's talk about farmers market sales. This is kind of a wrap up here because I know a lot of people have interest in selling at a farmer's market. Of course, you need to hold those products in a sanitary manner and at acceptable temperatures. That pretty much means frozen. I can tell you that we in the Department of Ag do not have a requirement that you have or provide mechanical refrigeration while you're at the farmer's market. We just simply want it to remain frozen. So if you have a very insulated ice chest and you keep it in the shade and it's not a particularly hot day, then probably all your product is going to remain frozen. If our compliance officer comes by, they might very well check. And they'll probably check with a thermometer, but they will also check just by touching, because obviously the outside of the product is going to thaw out before the inside. So if they take a package and they can tell that the outside is starting to thaw out, they're probably going to ask you to get that product chilled down again. I cannot speak for county health departments. They may have some specific requirements that may be a little bit different from one farmer's market to the next or from one county to the next. But in terms of West Virginia Department of Ag, I'm just saying that, if it remains frozen, then everybody's going to be happy on our end. Of course, it has to keep that mark of inspection on the packages unless they're produced under one of those exemptions. Nutritional information is required. If you're selling at a farmer's market, you are required to provide nutritional information for the major cuts of the red meats and of poultry, and I'll show you some examples of that in just a second. And there is no permit that's required by us, and I need to be very specific and exact with these words. No permit required by meat and poultry inspection to sell at a farmer's market. The distributor's license that we offer will pretty much cover that. Now, I know there are changes right now going into effect regarding farmers market sales, and there is another group within the Department of Ag that is handling some of that, those farmers market vendor permits. That you probably will need to be pursuing those if you're going to be selling at a farmer's market. But I think I'm going to leave that alone for the moment. I think as more information comes out, we'll be able to pass that along, and I don't want to create confusion by telling you something that may not turn out to be completely true. So I'm going to stick with what I know, which is get our distributor's license, and then your meat and poultry products should be okay. Next slide. And this is just about the nutritional information that you have to provide. And that's for the major single ingredient cuts of raw meat or poultry. Next slide. And here's some examples, and I can get these to you. You can find them on the FSIS website, or I can send them to you. Not a problem. It's PDF. There's one that covers beef and veal, one for pork and lamb, and then the next one will show for chicken and turkey. You do not have to have these on the package label. You can just simply print them out, post them wherever you're selling the meat. If you're selling it at your farm and you've got an outside building and their chest freezers in there, just post them up right there at the freezer. If you're selling at a farmer's market, just provide them, somewhere around where where you're selling that product. And again, you can either download them or I can send them to you. And I think we're getting pretty much to the end. So you've got my contact information there. You can either call, and then our website. I don't have my email address on there for some reason, but let me correct just a little bit of that and just say use the 558-2206 number, and my email is qjones@wvda.us. And with that, I'll stop and we'll see if there are any questions.
So thank you so much, Quinton. That was wonderful.